Hello, everybody. Um, I finally have seen Tenet, and there's just a couple of sort of interesting things I thought about it. One, in general, I liked it. It it wasn't The Prestige, which was not at all one of my favorite movies, or even one I ever really want to ever watch again. And even if I hadn't watched The Prestige with my professional magician uncle, it still would have not been something. Generally I don't dislike Christopher Nolan movies. Batman ones aside, because he has proven he doesn't know Batman at all, and for those of you who are going to start getting all bent out of shape, first of all, don't at me. Second of all, in the very first movie, even if you take out the horrible voice, now I admit when I saw Christian Bale as being Batman, I'm like, he looks the part, he's a handsome person, he's in good shape, he is a good actor, and he's proven he can do action. So I was looking forward to that. As soon as the voice came on, the Batman voice came on. I mean, we've had how many, decades now of Kevin Conroy's perfect Batman voice, and then he gets this. So I started laughing. I'm like, I can't take this seriously anymore. And at the end of the very first movie, what does Batman say to Ra's al Ghul? I'm not going to kill you, but I don't have to save you. Proves right then and there he doesn't know who the hell Batman is or what the hell the point is. I didn't think Dark Knight was that good of a movie. I know everyone's creaming themselves over Heath Ledger. I wonder how much they would be if he hadn't died. The best scene of that movie, though, was with him and basically Two Face or Harvey Dent in the hospital. And that was the only scene that I thought was like, oh, I actually enjoyed this scene. That was good. And even the sort of goofy walk he did at the end, I'm like, all right, that's the Joker. That's cool. The little moment at the end where people proved the Joker wrong or something like that, that was neat too. But overall, he's overrated. And Dark Knight Rises, or whatever the third one is, I was forced to see about 45 minutes of it at one point in time, and that was probably about an hour too much. So let's just get this out of the way right now. I don't like his Batman movies, and I hated The Prestige. I liked Memento, and honestly, I really liked Inception and Interstellar. I did. There were likable people. There was clever stuff going on. I generally am going to take an interest in things that show playing with consciousness, and then also, like Inception and Memento too. Uh, but honestly, I've seen Memento like once, maybe twice. I liked it. I will rewatch Inception. I don't know if I really need to rewatch Memento. And I like Interstellar. I'll rewatch that too. And you're getting into now like space time, physics, relativity stuff, and everything else like that. I love that stuff too. I'm not a physicist. I cannot do the maths involved with having to do these things, but I'm trying to make myself more intelligent about them as much as I can understand them without knowing the maths behind it. And there were a few parts of it that actually kind of reminded me almost of kind of a Spielberg vibe. Like the one thing where they're at school when the girl's still a kid and she gets in trouble with the school, and he goes in and they're like, well, what are you going to do to punish her? And he's like, well, there's this baseball game she wants to go to. I think I might take her to that, like a hot dog and some ice cream or whatever it is. But I thought like that was great. I love that. And there were some parts of it that kind of reminded me of almost like a Spielberg thing. So I like that. Um, Now Tenet, to me, this is going to be a wild analogy, but to me it makes sense. Tenet to me is almost seems like, and I don't know Christopher Nolan, I don't know what he's into, I don't know what he likes or anything like that. I don't want to make too many assumptions just because he's British. But to me seems like his 50 Shades of Grey if Doctor Who was Twilight. So if you don't know, 50 Shades of Grey started off as a Twilight fan fiction, like that needed to happen, and then evolved, very loose quotations with that, into 50 Shades of Grey, which completely gets wrong any sort of BDSM stuff. And from what I understand, I haven't read it. I have no interest in reading it. I read the first two Twilight books, and that was about 5 books too much for me. But it seems to me almost like Tenet was Christopher Nolan wanted to write a Doctor Who arc and then kind of couldn't do it, and or the closed time loop things that he did in it, like in Interstellar, where the messages they're getting or thinking from all these other things, it actually turns out it's from him with the whole relativity thing and going in between like kind of like the universes and everything. And since he knew that was going to happen, he was able to do it. So you kind of get this closed time loop sort of thing. Maybe Christopher Nolan couldn't do a Doctor Who story because Stephen Moffat did so many of those in his run, especially as showrunner, that they were like, this is a Stephen Moffat thing. We're going in a different direction. I don't know. I don't know. It had that sort of feel to me a little bit, and it could be again since since the was it WVIZ, the PBS here in Cleveland started airing Doctor Who in 1981, which was already 18 years old at that point in time. That's when I started watching Doctor Who, so maybe that has an effect on me, and there's any sort of time travel stuff, unless it's distinctly like Terminator or some other thing like that. Planes. Um, that I'm going to associate that. I don't know, but I was watching it and all I could think of is like Christopher Nolan wanted to write a Doctor Who arc, and this is it, but he couldn't make it into Doctor Who, so he just made it his own movie. That being said, I do feel, and I'm giving Christopher Nolan the benefit of the doubt here, I do feel like it would have been better served as a series, like a limited run series of like maybe 4 to 6 episodes, something like that, as opposed to trying to shove everything into one 2 hour, 2.5 hour movie. If you wanted to make it one movie, it had to almost be like sort of a extended edition of Lord of the Rings, where it needed to be longer, because it felt like there was things that happened and cuts that happened and movement of things and speeding portal going from one European or Indian city to another, and it seemed to happen really fast. And time, in terms of, okay, this is a reasonable amount of assumption that you can take to get from here to here, that almost it kind of had that Game of Thrones warp speed teleportation sort of thing going on with it. It seemed, and it seemed to things to happen very fast. Now, this is where I give the benefit of the doubt. There was part of this that, because of that sort of all of a sudden now, click, cut to something randomly else, and click, cut to something else. Because that there was a part that sort of reminded me of that little trickery thing they did with Rise of Skywalker, where they did that to try and throw you off the fact that this was a piece of shit movie and nothing makes sense and it's all garbage and we're ruining everyone and everything we've even looked at or touched ever in this movie. But if we jump from action to action and throw people around enough, maybe they won't notice. It kind of felt like that a little bit at times, but again, I'm giving Christopher Nolan and the movie makers credit that maybe they were forced to make cuts. Maybe they were forced to kind of condense things in such a way that had to seem that way in order to get it into the one movie, and the one movie under a certain time. They're like, if you go 3 hours, no. And I know that every time I watch anything about a movie or movie series, especially some of like horror series and things, I'll watch some of these little behind the scene things time and 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 time again. The vast majority of the time, if something's shitty about the movie, it comes into like the production company or the producers who really aren't making it, but they force things in that. For example, The Matrix. Originally, people weren't supposed to be batteries in it, and that doesn't make any sense because why can't the machines just build towers up high enough above the cloud thing, or use geothermal, or use hydroelectric, or if there's this hellscape enough, you can turn enough turbines, wind power. They had tons of other things they could have done instead of using people as batteries. It doesn't make as much sense as it was apparently supposed to be humans were basically their processing system. They're a literal neural net, and they were using that, as like their hard drive sort of thing, which would have made more sense because the human brain can process all these things, and the Matrix is the way that they're using that. That makes more sense, but it's probably the Weinsteins, if I remember correctly. It was the Weinsteins came in and befuddled it up and made it less than it could have been. So maybe this was going on with that too. It was like, okay, well, we can make this 3 hour movie and the pacing is much smoother and we can explain things and make more sense. It was like, no, you're going to make it in 2.5 or under 2.5 movies, and it's got to be breakneck in some ways. I don't know. But the general gist of it, I thought everyone did a really good job. And whomever it was, whether it was Christopher Nolan or just time or whatever it was that was able to sort of rein in Kenneth Branagh from being Kenneth Branagh, did an excellent job. Because I think since maybe after Much Ado About Nothing, Kenneth Branagh has a hard time reining in Kenneth Branagh. His Frankenstein and Hamlet should be proof of that. Anyway, uh, yeah, and Thor in some places was a bit much. Although there are some things with that kind of set up things as they go. I think if Thor 1 didn't go the way it is, we wouldn't have had Thor kind of go the way he did and have Taika Waititi come in and have Thor Ragnarok and have him be kind of funny. Because there were some funny parts in the first Thor, but there were some goofy stuff too. And I think sometimes Kenneth Branagh has a hard time getting out of Kenneth Branagh's way. But it seemed in this, they were able to do that. They were able to kind of rein him in and kind of focus him a little bit into the character in the movie. And it was really good to see because, I mean, Kenneth Branagh is generally a really good actor. It's just a little bit much sometimes in Kenneth Branagh. But everyone did a good job. I thought everyone was really good in it. And there was some stuff that were I don't know, again, I don't know if this is just because I've watched a lot of stuff with weird consciousness things and time travel and everything, or I'm used to Christopher Nolan movies now, but there was some stuff in it that was predictable. The one fight the protagonist had with the guy all in black where you couldn't see his face in the sort of fancy Euro warehouse, rich people cheap place. I was like, that's obvious. It's him. He's fighting himself. The only thing that twisted on it was, and they kind of explained it later, and I thought of it later, was like, oh, maybe this isn't it. I thought the second person, the one that Robert Pattinson's Neil was chasing, was himself because they showed him pull off the helmet. I thought he was chasing himself, and the other guy was fighting himself. But it turns out both were the same guy. Those are gonna be spoilers, okay? Um, with that, but then after they explain something and watching yourself go in and out of the turbines that turn you from kind of one time frame to another, then it was like, oh, you know what? It's probably both him then. And so there was some stuff I was able to figure out, and the way things happened and the way things were filmed, you could kind of guess some stuff. Like with one of the car chase things that they did, you can kind of guess a couple things where it's like, all right, that's going to come back later, and it's probably going to be him later coming back to it, and it was. I was not dis I wasn't disappointed when I figure stuff out, and that might be because honestly, I figure stuff out with some frequency, and it's not even really like any sort of Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot sort of powers or anything like that. I do, actively try and practice being observant and situational awareness and deductive reasoning and thinking things through. I do actively try and practice that, but also I've watched enough movies and TV shows and read on a lot of books and comic books and things like that to know that, okay, if they're setting this up now, if this comes back later, it's going to make sense if it's the same person or this other person or something like that. And it seems oracular in some places, but then it's sort of like, oh, that's just the way you craft a story. And especially since I've been working on trying to get better at crafting stories. So, you know, the one novel I've been trying to get published for 6 years now. The short stories I've been trying to get published for many years now. The other novel that I just finished this year for 5 months I've been trying to get published now. All these things that, I've had to pay attention to how to craft stories. And it's like you kind of have to set this up because if you just have it out of the blue, It's like, well, what the hell is that? You can just do anything at that point in time. It's almost like in some of the original Sherlock Holmes stories where it's like, oh, this person, oh, has a scar on his face, and Holmes like, oh, okay, and then later on is, well, I know it was this so and so Clay. I think it's Red-Headed League. All of a sudden, he knows it's so and so Clay because that's the description of the car. You never had anything earlier in the thing. You never had him, well, he was reading these things. Oh, so and so Clay. 6 months later, da da da. You didn't have any lead up to it. It's just Holmes happened to know that, and the reader had no input into this whatsoever. And yeah, I think it was Red-Headed League. Something I don't remember. It's Clay. I want to say is anyway. Anyway, it's beside the point. Um, so some of it is just kind of knowing how stuff gets put together. It doesn't usually detract for me because if it's done well, it's done well, and that's the way you're supposed to do this. Especially again, people. I know some people are like, why do you keep saying these words? I don't know what it means. Western Aristotelian storytelling, is going to have these things to it. They might not have it as much in other cultures that are keeping to their more traditional story types that wouldn't have as much influence from like classical sort of things as we do. Um, but so yeah, I liked it. I liked it. My problem with the movie, besides the pacing, because the pacing was sort of like I disliked having to think of it, but I thought about it. The pacing is such a way to make sure you're not stopping and thinking that this really wasn't explained well. And it just felt like you got a really quick description of things. You early on, you got told, don't think about it, just feel it. And that seemed like a sort of, if this doesn't make, what was it from Mystery Science Theater 3000? Just repeat to yourself, it's just a show, I should really just relax. So if things aren't making sense, and then you get one of these, you know, um, science celebrity gatekeepers that have to, puncture holes into everything and then make sure that anyone with any sort of new data that is valid and reliable but seems to fly in the face of what we know now, we can't have that. The people who want to poke holes in things and then, gatekeep this narrow view of things that we have at the moment, sort of taking that and be like, you know what, shut up, just watch the movie. And that's kind of what that line seemed about, where it's like, don't think about it, just feel it. And I understand they pulled it in, that it's an instinct thing to make things go back and forth, and you've got to feel it and get used to it because it's such a weird thing, because it's switching cause and effect on its head. I get it, but it also seemed like something for the audience to be like, shut up and watch the movie. It just seemed like the the time system. If this was a fantasy story, you could say that it seems like the magic system wasn't worked out fully, but they made it anyway. So it seemed like the time stuff wasn't worked out fully. They had some ideas of how to do it, and then we're like, don't think about it, just let it happen and feel it. I love the fake pitch meeting stuff that Ryan George does on Screen Rant. I think I've watched all of them except maybe one or two, and the only reason I haven't watched those is because I haven't seen the movies yet, but I want to. I don't want stuff spoiled, so I waited until after I've seen Tenet to actually. I waited, so I saw the movie before I watched the thing, because I didn't want stuff ruined. And he made a good point. So now, all of a sudden, if you're in the reverse entropy, inverse sort of time stream, you've got to have your own air sort of thing with you, because the air is going reverse, which is like, okay, but there will still be oxygen in the air, and you're still in your relative motion and perception. You have a certain forward in time linear mindscape that you're going through, and your body is still to a certain extent. If your respiration is reversed, then it almost seemed like that could still work or should still work. But at that point in time, if you're just worried about your air, how much of your physical mentality is through that? Because then your blood would go in reverse. Or, and this is what they were saying in the fake pitch meeting, so does that mean your eyes are emitting light now instead of gathering it? At which point in time that means that, your ears are basically a cacophony of horns instead of hearing. So if your one thing is reversed, how come everything else isn't too? And they were like, oh, well, please get off my back about that. And it's like, well, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that. The air thing kind of was like, would it though? Would it if you were inverted? Would your air? Because if you're still able to talk and think in what is for you a linear cause and effect sort of way, your respiration really wouldn't change. And the exchange of that wouldn't change unless your entire system is inverted. And then you've got more to worry about than just your air intake, because your blood's going backwards and everything too. So there were little things. It was almost sort of like, yeah, look, we have to have some sort of, it's almost like a D&D thing. Like, you can have all these, you can have wonderful armor, but your stealth now is at disadvantage. Even if the armor is perfectly made to you and doesn't, and it's form fitted and all this other stuff, you can't have super sneaky and super protected at the same time, sort of thing. You've got to give and take a little bit and balance it out. Yeah, but it just seemed like some of the stuff was a little rushed in terms of the time magic-y system of it. Now, again, don't at me if you're like, well, you're stupid, you don't get it. I get a lot of things, and I was able to understand Donnie Darko. I'm able to understand time stuff pretty well. Philosophical, mindscapey, consciousness, craziness, and everything else like that. I get it, but I'm also watching a movie, and I'm also someone who, again, like Sherlock, I can't always turn it off when I watch something, I get an idea, and it makes me think about it, which is kind of what you want with stuff like this anyway. But it made me think, like, they're not explaining this well. And there's a certain amount of, they get a little bit of explanation, and then maybe a clever thing like, well, what's happened, and then, oh, well, then, cutscene, don't think about it. And for example, too, they were operating under the premise for much of the movie that whomever is sending the stuff back from the future is doing so to destroy the past because they screwed up the future world. And then then they had the ritual conversation that you need about the grandfather clause, and then there's you got to think about, well, if they do that, if they destroy the past, since they're still in the future, does that mean that now we just have an arcing difference of a timeline, an alternate universe, so to speak, and that one goes along the way it is, but some the future may for maybe other people might be different. Well, obviously, if everything's gone, it's going to be different. Or do they think that changing the past is actually going to change their present? And would they even know if they were going to do that? But then all of a sudden, the one lady's telling them all this stuff about this algorithm thing that gets sent back in these different pieces, that the woman who created it in the future sent it back because it was so dangerous they didn't want it put together. And now it's just Kenneth Branagh's character who's putting them together because he's dying and he wants to take the world with him. So it's sort of like, is that the final thing, or is it really people wanting to end stuff before? Like, I thought, and this was what I was going with, it was like, all right, they were operating under this presumption that the people in the future wanted to end the past for whatever reason. And then it was the insight that the protagonist was able to get with, Kenneth Branagh's character's wife, Kat, who, the insight that she gave into his psychology, that was, no, since he's dying, he wants to take the world with him, which would also include his kid and all this stuff too, which is, really shitty. So my thing was like, okay, well, so they were wrong about their assumptions, which then also brings in a conversational piece. You have pieces of data. Okay, people are sending these things that might be dangerous back from the future. What are, you might not have the data to make an assumption about what it is that's going on and the dangers of making those assumptions if you don't have the full amount of data. Oh, well, people are sending us back from the future, they must want to kill us. Not necessarily, because there's the present people's interactions and psychology and behaviors and stuff to take into account too. It's like you always you see. I mean, I like serial killer documentaries and on the serial killer documentaries and let alone cop shows and stuff like that. Constantly, what you're seeing in both this fiction and reality thing, where some of these police people, they get a little bit of information, a little bit of data, then they automatically assume something, and then they base their investigation off of this erroneous assumption, and more people are getting killed, and more stuff is getting fucked up, time and time again, because the cops are looking somewhere else instead of where they should be looking at. This sort of a Sherlock Holmes Doctor Who thing. It's like you're fitting. I think it was from Doctor Who, Fourth Doctor. I think it's like you're fitting your. I'm going to paraphrase this because I'm blanking on the actual words right now. It's like you're fitting your opinion. You're fitting your facts to the opinion instead of the opinions to your facts. And that's what happens a ton of times. That people have a few facts and then they make an opinion of it. And then anything that doesn't agree with that opinion, they throw out, even though there are multiple other things that could be going on with the facts that they're getting. And was it the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock addressed that too in the one episode with the Chinese acrobats. It was he's saying, well, that's ridiculous. The guy came in through the window. It was like fact this, fact that. Only explanation that covers all the facts. And it was something that they didn't think of because they just like, well, it was just going to be a suicide. It was like, well, this doesn't make sense because all this stuff is over here, but he's left-handed. Instead, all this stuff is showing right-handed, left hand, left hand, left hand, left hand. So, he wouldn't have done it like this. There's no other breaking. The only other thing that could have happened was this other thing. So again, he had facts and he made the opinion fit the facts as opposed to facts to fit their opinion. So that's kind of another conversation that I think that Tenet could be able to bring in as well. So you've got consciousness, you've got time travel, you've got closed loop seeming paradox, but closed loop cause and effect sort of thing. You've got the whole thing about facts and opinions and everything else like that. So there's a lot to the movie that could bring up a lot of conversations. And again, I generally like the movie, and everyone in it was really good. It's just, I think, and again, I'm thinking the reason it could have been better, so to speak, is if they had more time. Ironically enough, if they had more time to really get into being able to get into is like, this is the system we're operating under, and this is what we mean by it. And you can do it correctly through like dialogue and action over time. It just felt like they didn't have enough time to really let it percolate and let it sit, so they kind of had to rush, and it felt rushed. And anything that reminds me of Rise of Skywalker is going to make me think, oh dear, no. But that being said, still worth a watch. I still liked it. Will I watch it again? I don't know, maybe. I would probably watch Inception and Interstellar maybe before this. Maybe I just got to let it sit in my brain pan for a while, maybe. But anyway, overall, good movie. I liked it. Glad I was finally able to watch it. And so, yeah, got other stuff coming up and a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. So I will talk at you later. Thank you. Oh, all the like, subscribe, share stuff too. YouTube-y kind of things. Appreciate it.